Right, well, it's almost 4 o'clock, so I think let's begin. And a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As winter approaches and it gets chillier in the evenings and darker earlier, it's great to have you all here. Firstly, I wanted to just say this is our first webinar since the fire at UCT, and just express our solidarity as an association with those who lost their offices, their research materials, their books, etc. And just to say that we are very sorry that you had to experience that. It's also the the first meeting since the sudden passing of Bob Scholes, and our condolences to Mary and the family. Bob was our presenter in April. And then before I introduce the presenter for today, just to mention that if anyone is wanting to claim CPD points for from SACNAS, please would you note your details in the chat, because we can't always see your full details from your names, and then we'll organize certificates for you. Okay, so on to today's presentation. Well, we're very pleased to have Professor Şerban Procheş from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He is Professor of Biogeography there. He hails from Bucharest, Romania, where he did his undergraduate studies and his master's studies, but he did his PhD at UKZN. Şerban has focused on ecological and evolutionary drivers of biogeographical patterns, both locally and globally, and we look forward to hearing all about that in this talk today. So thank you so much for taking the time to present this webinar to us, and we'll hand over to you now, Şerban.
Yeah, thanks Glynis for the introduction, and good afternoon everyone. And yeah, what I suppose Glynis didn't go into details about what exactly I was working on at each stage, but since I'm talking to botanists, it's probably a good idea to say a few words in that direction. So in Romania, I was initially working on insects. My PhD was marine, looking at marine mites, of all things. And then I did 3 postdocs that were all proper botany with Richard Cowling, with Dave Richardson, and with Steve Johnson. And just as I was about to become a proper dignified botanist, I ended up taking a job in geography. So when I was asked to give a talk here today, thought it may be wiser of me to stay on the at least partly geographical side, but nevertheless say something of some interest to botanists. Let me share my screen. Can you guys see it? Okay, all right. So I'm going to speak about plant geography. Let me make it full screen. And there are at least three different aspects to plant geography that I see as different, and I see in a way that they probably should be staying different, and I'll argue that in my presentation. So I'm going to start with a little comparison of plant geography and animal geography. Animal geography has a proper name, it's zoo geography. Now what plant geography is, different people use different words, so I'm just going to call it plant geography. You know, if you have kids and you're trying to explain to them which animals live where, it's not difficult at all. So you're going to find lovely wall maps and puzzles and everything that will say kangaroos are in Australia and tigers are in Asia, and some of them will go as far as to show the same animal on 2 continents, which is starting to be a bit of a two-way occurrence table, and that's more or less what we want to see in biogeography. So what you're seeing here are 5 results that I got when I Googled something like animal world map kids, something like that. Now, if you replace animal with plant, you get all sorts of things that are unrelated. And the closest thing to the previous slide that I found was this 1,000-piece puzzle that very dubiously suggests that flowers in Asia are blue and flowers in South Africa are lilac. So maybe we're not really geared, our kids are not really geared to understand plant geography as well as they would understand zoo geography. And maybe ourselves as grown-up kids, we didn't quite get that as early and as well as we should have. But at the same time, if you were looking at those puzzles with animals on, the plants were actually there. Behind the animals, there was a bit of green and a bit of brown and a bit of yellow. And that suggests that there's actually, you can already get the idea at this point that there is more than one way of looking at plant geography. And most of you would be familiar with this already. So how do plants split the world? Plants split the world in at least 3 different ways. So what you're seeing on the left is just a list of species from a flora. So you can look at this list in 2 different ways. On the one hand, you can look at the number of species you have there, and you can compare how many species you have in one region and how many species you have in another region. And you can start building up a world map of plant diversity. On the other hand, you can look at the identity of these species in one region compared to another region. And you can look at what genera and what families these plants belong to. And that eventually, slowly, builds towards a map of floral kingdoms. And that is the plant equivalent of saying kangaroos live in Australia and tigers live in Asia. Now, apart from these 2, the one that's probably most obvious, one on the right, is looking at biomes. So you say, oh, forget about all the species you have, just look at the big ones. Have you got trees? How many trees? Are they dominant? Have you got shrubs? Are the shrubs dominant? And so on. So that would be the third way of looking at global plant geography. What are the factors that actually sit behind these 3 ways of looking at plant geography? So biomes and whatever falls within biomes as lesser units, things like vegetation types, they're primarily determined by climate. And for those of you who were there last week when William Bond was talking about biomes, he actually made the very pertinent point that it's not all climate. You also have fire and herbivores, and they can actually determine what you find in about 1/3 of the land on Earth, because climate alone doesn't determine the biome there. But I would say, if you have something that explains 2/3 of the variation in something else in ecology, that's not too bad. And in fact, climate, fire, and herbivores, you can actually put them all together and say, these are present-day environmental factors. So essentially, biomes are determined by present-day environmental factors. Now, to understand where kingdoms and regions and provinces come from, and there's one word for all of these levels, we can call them phytochoria. Looking at the present-day environment is insufficient. So you actually need to go back into history, and you need to look at tectonic movement, you need to look at changes in the climate, and so on. What determines diversity? That's a bit of a mixed bag. So on the one hand, you will see, as I go along with the presentation, there's quite a bit that's trying to persuade us that present-day patterns in plant diversity are very well explained by present-day climate. I will try to argue that it's mostly otherwise, without denying that present-day climate does play a role. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking a bit about the history of biomes and floral kingdoms, and also the history of mapping diversity. And then I'll get to some more recent studies, including some of my own. So basically, all of these three approaches, conceptually, one can argue that all three of them were started by von Humboldt. And that's unsurprising. I mean, he was not only the father of biogeography in general, he was the father of all sorts of fields of knowledge that we as biogeographers may not know very much about. His main work where these ideas were explained was Essai sur la géographie des plantes, and that was as early as 1805. But there were ideas that he put forward in others of his numerous writings as well. So we start in Germany, and well, you're about to discover that plant geography, at the very least, its early days were very much a German affair. So if you're worried about listening to a bit of German, and especially if you're worried about listening to German in a Romanian accent, then maybe you're in the wrong place. So in terms of floral kingdoms, possibly the most important early name, going beyond the very simple conceptual ideas that von Humboldt put forward, was Gottfried Treviranus. And from there on, possibly another very important name was Alphonse de Candolle, who was French by birth, but subsequently lived mostly in Switzerland. And one of the very important things that de Candolle did, he also spoke about cosmopolitan distribution. So he spoke about plant families and genera that you find throughout the world. And I would argue that's potentially a fourth way of looking at global plant geography, except it's one aspect that has not really been taken forward. I've done a bit of work on cosmopolitan vertebrates myself, but I haven't done anything on cosmopolitan plants, and neither has really done anyone else. There are a couple of papers that on the concept borderline, but I think it would be very important in a plant invasion perspective. And then also getting back to floral kingdoms, another important name is Diels. So Diels was someone who had a special interest in the Cape Floral Kingdom, and especially in drawing up the boundaries around it. Diels was actually a student of Adolf Engler, and I have to actually dwell a bit on Engler because apart from Vegetation der Erde, which was 1896, 1 year before that, he put together the Pflanzenwelt Afrikas. That's a work that I was already familiar with back in Romania. And that's how I became acquainted with African plants in the first place. And I have to say, I've been in South Africa 20 years now, and I'm not sure if I've seen a single piece of work that encapsulates as nicely the African flora. So that was 1895. I'm still waiting for the follow-up to that. So Engler, I mean, he wrote a monstrous amount of works, not single-handedly. So he had collaborators, and I'm not too sure. I haven't tried to dig to find out how much was his own work. Perhaps he was one of the early exponents of the current approach to science, which is more or less the pyramid scheme approach to science. But he produced, or at the very least, he coordinated a huge amount of plant geography works of all kinds. And if you're looking at this one, so that's actually an earlier work from 1879. You can already see here that he was proposing a number of floral kingdoms. So that's, I have to move the things on the screen to see what it says there. Das nördliche extratropische Florenreich. So that's the northern extratropical floral kingdom, which he subdivides into regions. So the word for region in German is Gebiet. A would be das arktische Gebiet, and then B was das subarktische oder Koniferengebiet. And he goes on like that. And within the regions, he goes on to subdivide them into provinces. Westliche Provinz, östliche Provinz, and so on. And not only does he do that, he actually substantiates each one of these levels with a number of endemic, or at least characteristic, plant species, genera, families, and so on. Already in the 1870s, the idea of phytochoria across multiple levels was actually very well established. And this map that you're seeing is also from his work. I actually sourced it from one of the online encyclopedias, and this morning I was frantically looking to try to find it again to see which one of his works it's from, and I never found it again. I just discovered more and more and more of his works that I was not aware of. He truly wrote huge amounts of plant geography. But in any case, it's a map from the 19th century. And what you're seeing very clearly here in different colors are different biomes. He doesn't use the word, I'll get back to that. But also, if you're looking carefully, you're going to see some thin lines which indicate where the various kingdoms and regions start and end. So in one map, we've got kingdoms and we've got biomes. We've got a very clear distinction between the two, and it's not fundamentally different from the way we teach kingdoms and the way we teach biomes in 2021. What happened to floral kingdoms subsequently? Of course, as there was an increase in the knowledge of plant systematics and of the distribution of these groups, Engler's system had to be updated. And there were at least two very important names here that I have to mention. One was Armen Takhtajan. So he was an Armenian botanist. There wasn't an independent Armenia when he was born. He was born in the Russian Empire, which subsequently became the Soviet Union. And only very late in his life was there an independent Armenia. And the map that you're seeing there is one step further from what Engler proposed, but I would argue not fundamentally different. And to the English-speaking world, possibly more important would be Ronald Good, who published several issues of his work on plant geography. And possibly in terms of a structured system with kingdoms and regions within them. This may actually be the most thorough work to look at the present day. Now, if we're talking about biomes, as I said, Engler already had the biomes on his maps. He didn't use the word biomes. So the first person to use the word biomes in a geographic sense, not in a purely local scale ecological sense. So ecologically, it would have been Clement, but geographically, it's Tansley. And subsequently, there have been many researchers who made substantial contributions to fine-tuning the distribution of biomes and the identity of biomes. But if I were to name one other person in a more contemporary way, it would have to be Colin Prentice. Now, just taking one step back here. So these works by Engler, by Takhtajan, and by Good, that's what I would call analog plant geography. And that's very common sense work. It's work that we can verify. We can look at the lists of plants that they were looking at, the way they put them together. We can understand exactly how they came up with these kingdoms and regions and so on. And when I'll get to the part about looking at plant diversity and looking at phytochoria in a contemporary context, things are quite different, and we're struggling with data. Mapping diversity, so getting now to mapping diversity, that's something that didn't start quite as early as that, because there wasn't an equally comprehensive knowledge of plant diversity at the species level across the world to be able to map diversity. The first person to produce a global map of plant diversity as such, with different levels of plant diversity in different shades, was a Russian, Austrian-educated Crimean. He lived most of his life in Crimea, by the name of Yevgeny Vladimirovich Wolf. And you can see the map, and it's fairly difficult to interpret, apart from the fact that in the Arctic there aren't many plants, which is fairly straightforward. The next major step from Wolf onwards was Bartlott. So Wilhelm Bartlott is, without a doubt, the one name intrinsically linked to the mapping plant species diversity. The map that you're seeing now, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is a map from 2005. He had a slightly less polished version from 1996. Started by publishing in fairly obscure journals, and it took a while before he was noticed by the English and the French speakers who made more of a difference. So you can quite clearly see here on this map the major centers of plant species diversity are in tropical rainforest in South America, in Southeast Asia, but also in South Africa's Cape and also in southwestern Australia. In terms of explaining where this species diversity comes from, this is one of the studies that use present-day climatic variables to explain diversity. So it's a study by Holger Kreft and Walter Jetz. And you can see the combined model that they come up with, and you can recognize the high diversity in tropical rainforest, but not so much the diversity in the Cape and southwestern Australia. And I'll have to get back to that. So for anyone who's trying to make a progress from these studies onwards in plant geography, the key question is, what data are you going to use? So 30 years back, if someone wanted a set of maps with plant distributions, the best one could do was families. I'm saying now a set of maps to be found in one place, in one single source. So you had to look at families, and you had to look at this book on flowering plant families over the world by Vernon Haywood and his collaborators in Britain and Denmark. And the maps in this book, I'm going to put it bluntly, are grossly inaccurate and completely inappropriate for mapping anything that would be relevant in an analysis for mapping diversity, or in an analysis for mapping floral kingdoms or any other phytochondria. Nevertheless, some people whose names shall not be mentioned did digitize this data, and they used it and they published it in a high-ranking journal. Yes, such things are being done. And luckily, today we have better sources than that. So if we're looking for plant family distribution maps, we have the maps put together by Peter Stevens and his collaborators on the Angiosperm phylogeny website. Peter started more or less single-handedly, and now it's a team, it's a massive team effort, and really the one-stop shop for anyone who wants to know anything about plant phylogenies or about well, many other aspects, including distributions. So it is down to family level, but it does, in some interesting cases, he does provide maps for subfamilies and for some of the smaller units as well. There's been a third way to go about it, coordinated from Kew Botanic Gardens by Raphael Hovaerts. Started, if I'm correct here, it started with the monocots and subsequently it expanded to other seed plants. The one problem I find with this data set is that occurrences are recorded for political units, so primarily at country level, and then within the larger countries, he splits them a bit into provinces or states, or in some cases, regions made of one or two provinces together. And now coming into a fully contemporary landscape, we've got big data. And we've got top-down big data and we've got bottom-up big data. I'm just going to give one example of each. So for top-down, the best example is probably GBIF, and you're seeing a map of all the records the way it was a few years back. So you can see on land, the number of records is well correlated with the number of rich people that live in that area. And in the sea, it's well correlated with the number of ships that cross this way and that. But nevertheless, one can actually use this data and come up with a very realistic map of terrestrial and marine species diversity. And then in terms of bottom-up approaches, we've had about a month ago, we had Tony Rebello and a few others spoke to us about iNaturalist. So if anyone doesn't know this, it's a platform where you can upload your photographs of any living creature that you find, and you can identify it yourself, or you can ask the others to provide an identification. So it started off as a student project in California, and now it's grown into a massive species distribution database. Now, if we're looking at the data from iNaturalist, this is once again number of records, and we can still see the same bias in terms of where people are likely to look at nature and take pictures of nature. So this is the number of records for vascular plants, and I'm going to zoom in taxonomically a bit. If we restrict the data to conifers, this is what we get. And then if we're looking at one coniferous, or should I say gymnosperm genus, Afrocarpus, you will see that Afrocarpus does occur in Africa, as the name suggests, but you'll also see a few data points in all sorts of places like China and Australia, United States, and New Zealand. And the reason for this, there could be two major groups of reasons for this. One could be misidentification. And the second one could be that someone indeed photographed an Afrocarpus in those places. It's just that it was cultivated or less likely naturalized or invasive. Now, if it's a misidentification, that's a major issue, no matter what the reason is for you to look at the distribution of this genus. If it's a cultivated or naturalized plant, then it's less than ideal if you're trying to extract natural distributions alone. So how does one go about it? I mean, we've got these huge data sets. And if you're interested in a small group of plants, you can actually go and look at every record and confirm that it's correctly identified. You can use your judgment regarding whether that's the natural distribution or it's been introduced there. But what do you do if you want the full data set? There have been recent attempts to use even artificial intelligence. I mean, starting with simple things like excluding plants defined as, I don't know, uncertain identification and so on. That's one way of looking at it. But you can go deeper into artificial intelligence with that. But then, of course, there's a saying that artificial intelligence can be no match for human stupidity. So how exactly one extracts the data if you want big data, if you want full data from these data sets, remains problematic, and I'll get back to that. Now, if we're looking at recent developments in terms of biomes, there has been one recent very interesting development in terms of classifying vegetation types into biomes globally, led by David Keith from Australia, and also with a primarily Australian team. And initially, I was a bit skeptic looking at a classification proposed by an Australian team, which suggests that out of 30 or 40 biomes in the world, 5 or 6 can only be found in Australia. However, especially after having listened to William Bond last week, he was making the point that herbivores and fire can determine what biome you end up with in a certain part of the world. So they make this very important distinction between pyric and trophic savanna, pyric and trophic shrublands, and so on. So I think it's actually an important development. But apart from that, most of the biomes that they list here are not really fundamentally different from 1895 Engler, even though he didn't call it that. So let's look at a few recent developments in terms of mapping diversity, in terms of explaining diversity, in terms of testing phytochoria, and also in terms of data. You know, one thing you can do if you're not in the position to extract a solid global data set for all plants, you can restrict your work to one group of plants, for example, to one growth form. So this is the study that you're seeing now is looking at tree diversity patterns worldwide. And that's a far more solid data set than you would get for any herbaceous plant. This work out of China, very, very interesting work in two ways. So it picks on explaining global patterns of plant diversity. But it diverges in two ways from the work of Kreft and Yates. On the one hand, it moves up taxonomically, so it doesn't look at species, it looks at genera and families. And secondly, it compares how climatic variables explain plant diversity at the global scale and the way they explain it at the regional scale. And that's a very important point to make, because past climates are far better described in a regional context, because they have varied substantially from one region to another. I was saying a move away from species. Now, there are multiple ways in which one can move away from species. And one way is not to stop at genera and families, but actually combine levels of relatedness into one index. And you get several indices that do that. So traditionally, one that has been used is phylogenetic diversity. So here in this study by Ian McFadden, you're seeing taxonomic diversity, and you're seeing two aspects of phylogenetic diversity: tip-weighted beta diversity and basal-weighted beta diversity. And I'd like to point out how different these maps are. So if one stops at species diversity, you have one image of plant diversity across the world. But there are so many other ways of quantifying plant diversity that go beyond species. Also, a study from our own South African, not born and not currently based, but very much cut his teeth here, Barnabas Daru, who's now at Texas A&M. Study looking at different ways of measuring biodiversity, primarily in an evolutionary context. The study is looking at plants and several vertebrate groups. The map that you're seeing here is the map for plants, and there are three ways of measuring plants. And what they're doing is comparing how these measures of evolutionary diversity compare with the accepted biodiversity hotspots. And you can recognize some patterns there on the map, and you can also see some new things diverging from species diversity patterns. Another very recent study in Nature, Ecology and Evolution by Santiago Ramirez Barahona from Mexico, with Susana Marayon, who's also Mexican, and with Hervé Soquet. What they're doing is they're looking at the distribution and diversity of plant families and how long plant families took from their first appearance to the point where they diversified substantially. And what they're essentially saying is plant families that are better represented in arid and in cold environments diversified very soon, whereas plants in rainforest, families that are most diverse in rainforest, took a while to diversify. And I would argue that's another very interesting way of looking at plant diversity. So I'm getting to a bit of my own work. This is one study with Sid Ramdani, long-term collaborator of mine here at UKZN, but also in this case with Alice Hughes and Liang Ping Ko. So what we did is we divided plant diversity into those lineages that were already present at the last mass extinction, which would have been 66 million years ago, and two mass extinctions ago, which would have been 201 million years ago. And in both cases on the maps, you can see quite nicely a very clear Southeast Asian diversity peak. Also with SID, we did one other study. We measured things along the same lines, a bit differently. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but once again, we're showing high diversity in Southeast Asia, and this time also in Central America and the Andes. And what we also did with this data set is we used it to see how our units of analysis, which are the regions taken from Ronald Good, how do they cluster based on the representation of these ancient plant lineages? And what we found is we found a northern temperate and arid cluster. Then we found a tropical, mostly humid and mesic cluster. So we know that we knew already from the works of Engler and Good and Akhtarjan, we knew that tropical Africa and tropical Asia are not as different from one another in plants as they are in animals. But nevertheless, in all of these previous classifications, the South American tropics, the neotropics, were viewed as a different floral kingdom. We didn't really recover a strong divergence between the neotropics and the paleotropics in this case. And what is very interesting, we actually recovered a fairly weak, but nevertheless, it's there, cluster with the southern tip of South America and New Zealand. So this is what has been known for a while in plant bioregionalization as the Antarctic floral kingdom. So a first fairly timid effort with a very small number of plant lineages and a small number of geographical units, but nevertheless, it tends to recover those patterns that we already knew, with some differences, of course. Now, in terms of putting together complete data sets of plant species distributions, you know, for vertebrates, there are a couple of such data sets that have been around for a while. We've already analyzed them in all sorts of ways. So for plants, we're still struggling, and possibly the most ambitious effort is the one from Patrick Weigelt and his collaborators, and they call it GIFT, a global inventory of floras and traits. They're also including traits. That's why I'm saying it's quite ambitious. But if you're looking at the maps they're putting together there, geographically, the data set is quite incomplete. And also from Barnabas Daru, we have something in the same direction, possibly less ambitious, but more geographically complete. So he calls it green maps. So I think, you know, we're still struggling a bit with plant species level data sets globally, but I think it's slowly getting there. But if we were to summarize everything that I said so far, in terms of phytochoria and in terms of biomes, we've got tons of new data, we've got new methods of analysis, and we've got relatively little change. So it's amazing how robust these schemata that were proposed already in the 19th century with very limited knowledge and no analytical methods, how robust they can be. On the other hand, when it comes to diversity mapping, there is progress in terms of the methods used, and there's also progress in terms of the explanations. And especially, I think, when I say methods, I'm referring to new measures of plant diversity. So we're no longer restricted to plant species diversity, which in fact, after seeing lots of other maps, we can realize that species level diversity is quite an unusual pattern, atypical, very different from what you're seeing when using other sorts of measures. So, you know, I'm going to end by saying we've got biodiversity patterns, we've got phytochoria, we've got biomes. Should we be putting them all together? I think it's very useful to actually find links between them. I mean, it's very easy to see that different biomes have different levels of plant diversity. Different phytochoria have different levels of plant diversity. Different biomes are not evenly represented across phytochoria. Should we not come up with one measure and just stick to one measure when looking at global plant geography? There have been suggestions along these lines, especially looking at incorporating evolution into the definition of biomes. I have been actually arguing the opposite way. So while I think it's very useful to see how various concepts interact, I think species diversity, other measures of diversity, phytochoria, they all feed into the species-centered approach to conservation, whereas biomes feed into the ecosystem function approach to conservation. And I think we need both of those approaches. So I think plant diversity is, plant geography is complex, and it probably needs to stay complex. We probably need to wrap our minds around at least 3 different types of maps. Well, thank you for your time, and yeah, looking forward to any questions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Şerban. That was very interesting. You took me back to some undergraduate years with Ronald Good's book of biogeography, and then took us through a whole history of things that I didn't even know had their basis in biogeography. I guess I should know, but that was really interesting. Thank you. So, some questions. You can raise your hand, or you could write in the chat that you would like to ask a question. Any questions?
Glynis, it's Tim Hoffman here.
Thanks, Tim. Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, Şerban. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk. I really enjoyed the history. Could you say something a little bit more? It's a very specific question, but a little bit more about, I think you mentioned it earlier on, about Ludwig Diels' work in the Cape. You said he was very involved in the delineation of the Cape region, and perhaps I don't know any of that work, and perhaps you could talk about the plant work, animal work. Perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit for me.
It was plant work. I can actually email you. There's one chapter by a Chilean author that I just read recently, and it was very useful for this presentation, that whole chapter. But he actually takes you quite a bit of details through Uranus and also Diels, and you will find a few specific details even about the Cape. I can email you all that. I wouldn't be able to quote verbatim exactly what he did, but I can send you the references.
Thank you. That'll be really interesting.
I think Michelle was here and she had a question, eh?
Yes, thanks. I joined the session late. Hi, Şerban. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I missed sort of the first half of the talk, but thank you for the rest. Good to hear. I'm just actually trying to look up, I think some of these metrics that deal with phylogenetic diversity and yeah, specifically phylogenetic diversity, look at the phylogenetic distinctness after controlling for species richness. How useful do you think such a metric is in terms of assessing phylogenetic or assessing a measure of diversity. Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing your opinion.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, yeah, it's a very interesting question. So for everyone, Michelle is actually a co-author on that study that I presented from Barnabas. Look, when I say that some of the maps produced using these metrics are very different from those based on species diversity, I'm quite confident some of them are not correcting for species. They're already very different. But it's a very valid point that some of them may be different because they're correct. I would have to do some serious thinking about the usefulness of correcting species diversity. Honestly, I'm not a fan of species diversity in biogeographic studies at all. So I think species are extremely useful in a local scale context. What do you do with species when you move beyond local scale? I think species are more likely to create confusion. So you've got species that can occur sympatrically, but you also have closely related species that are completely allopatric. They never meet. If you take a large enough geographic unit into the analysis, you're going to end up with those two species counted as two species in the same unit. But in fact, another taxonomist may well say, actually, that's one and the same species. They're just subspecies or geographic varieties or something like that. So, you know, adding species across large scales, I don't think it's very useful in the first place. And what is a large scale is another question. Because for snails, you could have two of those so-called species 5 kilometers away from each other. Or in the Cape, you could have plant species 100 kilometers away from each other, or even less. But then again, if you're looking at birds with good dispersal abilities, it may take half a continent for you to have that problem. So how one defines the geographic units has to be taxon dependent, and the more taxa you pile together and the greater the diversity of dispersal modes within those taxa, the more meaningless, in fact, the total number of species is. Yeah, in terms of correcting for species diversity, yeah, that's beyond any thinking that I've done so far. But I hope if I didn't answer your question, I hope I've graciously walked around it. Another question from James. Hey, I don't know which James that was. James Roger. Hi, James.
Yes, thanks for a really interesting talk. I was just wondering if if perhaps we could get. Sorry, I'm just noticing how camouflaged I am against the rocks here. But I was wondering, in terms of influence of past climate and also past geology on patterns of distribution, I was wondering what your take on the Ockbill Yodfill concept was, and where you think that's useful.
Yeah, thanks for that. You know, so for any of those who don't know that, Stephen Hopper, who was the director of Kew at one point, but who's from Southwestern Australia, came up with the Ockbill. So that's old, climatically, you know the full thing, climatically stable something, as opposed to Yodfill, which is young, dynamic types of environments. And essentially, he proposes this theory whereby you have old, climatically stable and young, dynamic types of environments. I think those are useful ends of a continuum. I don't think globally you have too many different regions that at region scale operate as OCBILs entirely. So I think conceptually it's very useful, but analytically, there are limitations to where you can use these concepts. That's probably as much as I could say at this point, eh?
Okay, great. Thanks, Şerban.
There are some comments.
Yeah,
Okay, no, I'm not seeing questions there.
no. No. Good. Any more questions from anyone? No? Okay, Tim has given you the explanation of the acronym. It's OCBIL is Old Climatically Buffered Infertile Landscapes. There you go. Thanks, Tim.
Buffered was the word I couldn't get right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Climatically buffered. So not necessarily stable, but buffered. It's a better word because complete climatic stability is not necessarily the best for promoting diversity. So a bit of variation, a bit of slow variation in climate, in topography, can actually promote speciation. So buffered is a far more appropriate word in that context. Thanks for that.
Could I ask again, sorry, could I ask again how biogeographers use these distribution maps and patterns of distribution, how they use them to try and explain why one area is more rich than another area? I mean, do they use this mapping, the distributions, to come up with additional theories, new theories about, you know, why the Cape is so rich relative to, say, California or the Mediterranean? Is this form a rich part of the theory around this, the mapping of species distributions?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think, you know, fundamentally new hypotheses are not something I'm seeing all the time. Maybe I'm missing some of them. And also keep in mind, truly original work will often get ignored. So maybe I never come across it. Maybe it is out there. But the mainstream ecological and biogeographical hypotheses about species diversity, they tend to be very much recycled. We're testing them with new methods over and over. There have been a few turning points in explaining diversity. I mean, from island biogeography, and then it was a bit resurrected by Rosenzweig. And, you know, my impression is that ecology does a bit too much recycling. And it's too much about new methods and improved data. I very much prefer to see new hypotheses. But yeah, perhaps the ones that are truly new are failing to come to the fore.
Yeah, I've just had to, while I asked the question, I've just had to prepare some lectures on Fynbos, and I haven't read the literature for quite a while, and I was struck how in the last 10, 15 years, how rich the ideas are about explaining the diversity of the Cape, you know, all the way from the sort of, so at a smaller regional level, it seems to be extremely rich how distributions are explained. If I think of these ideas about Levins's law, about the Paleoagulous plain, the idea of sky islands that Zainab, the first speaker on this webinar series, spoke about for the Kogelberg area. If I think about Steve's work on pollinator-driven speciation, it's just such a rich, there's so much material for the Cape. And I just wondered to what extent at a global level, these sorts of ideas were emerging and if it was as industrious and as interesting as what's been going on in the Cape for the last 20 years.
I think the Cape is actually one place that generates ideas a lot. Leibniz's law, because you mentioned that, I think that is one of the few fundamentally new approaches. So let's not look at latitude, let's look at longitude. And if you're thinking of the weather patterns, air circulation, longitude should actually be more relevant than latitude. And latitude, in fact, is being quite seriously disproved as a primary driver of species diversity, because it actually confounds two things. It confounds energy and history, because the poles were heavily glaciated, and those are the same areas that are getting the least energy today. So I'm actually working with Richard again on a project looking at that and trying to look at longitudinal patterns globally. We'll see how that's going to be received. I'm hoping we can make a difference, because latitude, and I also have to pick on the use of the word explanation, because you use the word explanation, you know. I think that word is being abused, and especially in a latitudinal context, it's being abused. There are so many papers looking at latitudinal patterns, and they all start with the same story. Despite so much work, it's still incompletely explained. You're asking me, it's too much explained. It's explained beyond what it should be. And William was also saying last week, if you're doing enough correlation studies, you'll find a good correlation between anything and anything. And that's not an explanation. But I would prefer to say there are numerous factors that are somehow linked to high species diversity. The direction of the link is not, you know, species diversity is always a dependent variable. Should it be? I think what I'm trying to tell my students, and maybe I'm being too, maybe I'm pontificating, but what I'm always telling them is the words why, understand, and explanation. leave them at home, because all we have is patterns, we have variables, we can find links between them. And of course, if we want to solve a problem, if we move to a problem-solving approach, then we actually need to put things in a causality perspective and decide on the actions to take. But if we're just trying to explain what we're seeing, maybe we should be putting multiple arrows in all directions on a flow chart. Otherwise, maybe we shouldn't be putting arrows at all. But you know, it's hard to move away from the explanation narrative, because ultimately every paper is a story. Every paper that we're writing, if it doesn't read like a good story, it doesn't get published. We have to work into that causality framework, but that causality framework doesn't actually fit in very well with the scientific method. I'm clearly going far off at a tangent, but you're right. In the Cape, there's a lot happening. There are lots of ideas in the Cape. There are quite a few ideas in the Amazon and in the Andes, and more recently, there's a bit happening with the Himalayas and the Hengduan Mountains in South China. So there are a few places around the world that are clearly good places to look at and put together new ideas. My feeling is that most ideas globally are recycled, and most of the new ideas work well in one region, but perhaps not so well globally. And if something could work well globally, Of course, that would make waves, but at the same time, maybe we need to move away from global. Maybe we need to accept that climatic patterns that are regionally specific need to be more taken to the fore. Of course, it means we're going more descriptive. It's less scientific. It's not going to make it into the weeklies. But I think there's often more explanatory power within regions than there is globally. But thanks for that question. It's certainly, if it made me rant, it means I'll be thinking about it a bit more. Thanks for that.
Thanks very much, Şerban. Thank you.
Right. Anyone else got a burning question? No? Yes, no? Okay. All right, well then I think all that remains is for me to say thank you so much, Şerban, for a very, very stimulating talk, for giving us, as someone said, a rich history and helping us to think more critically maybe about the distribution maps that we see and how they should be interpreted. And then just to mention for those who don't know that the International Biogeography Society has been having a series of webinars, excuse me, over the last sort of 9 months, I think it is probably, in honor of Vicky Funk. And you can find those webinars on their webpage if anyone is interested, seeing as we're on biogeography this week. Right, so thank you for joining us. Thank you very much once again, Şerban.
Thanks, Glynis, and thanks everyone.